A millionaire forced his youngest daughter to marry the son of the maid to punish her. However, he was shocked by what he had done. Adrian Montero was a man of precision and command. His office was more than just a workspace. It was a reflection of his disciplined mind. Multiple screens displayed streams of code and market trends, a seamless orchestra of technology surrounding him. Every detail was meticulously arranged to maintain focus, from the high-end leather chair that resembled a modern-day throne, to the rows of gadgets flashing with notifications, demanding his attention. Adrian was not just a tech mogul. He was a strategist, a man who shaped the world according to his beliefs. So, when he discovered that his youngest daughter, Isabela, was romantically involved with a musician with no career prospects, he felt a tight knot form in his chest, the kind that no amount of success could untangle. His mind raced, considering every scenario in which this relationship could lead her to a life of uncertainty. It wasn't just about her future. It was about protecting the legacy he had painstakingly built. He would not allow Isabela to be swept away by what he saw as a reckless fantasy. Adrian summoned Thomas to his office. The young man was diligent and always knew when to show respect. As the son of the family's housekeeper, Thomas had grown up around the mansion, working odd jobs to help finance his engineering studies. He was no stranger to Adrian's demanding nature, but when he received the unexpected call to the main house, he couldn't help but feel a wave of apprehension. As he stepped into the office, Thomas noticed the air seemed heavier than usual, as if the weight of whatever was about to be discussed already hung between them. Adrian didn't waste time with pleasantries. His voice carried a certain gravity, an unspoken expectation that no one dared to challenge. "Thomas," he began, his deep tone echoing in the room, "I've always seen you as an example of determination and ambition." Thomas stood, hands clasped behind his back, eyes attentive. He knew better than to interrupt Adrian Montero, and so he waited, despite the tension tightening in his chest. Adrian leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas with a calculating gaze. "I have a proposition for you. It may seem unconventional, but it could be beneficial for everyone involved." Thomas's brow furrowed slightly, his mind racing with possibilities. Was it a new job offer? A scholarship? The certainty in Adrian's voice told him that it would not be an ordinary request. "I'm here for whatever you need, Mr. Montero," he replied, his voice steady though uncertainty buzzed beneath the surface. Adrian's gaze did not waver. "I want you to marry my daughter, Isabela." The room seemed to contract around Thomas, his pulse quickening. Had he misheard? He searched Adrian's expression for signs that this might be some twisted joke, but Adrian was not a man known for jokes. There was only the cold, unwavering stare of a father who had already made up his mind. "Marry Isabela?" Thomas repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, the idea seemed absurd. Isabela was a world apart from him, elegant, headstrong, and fiercely independent. Their interactions over the years had been limited, almost always framed by her distant politeness. The rumors of her recent relationship with a struggling musician had reached even him. The notion of marrying her seemed not only unrealistic but impossible. "Yes," Adrian continued, as though Thomas's shock was merely a minor inconvenience to be managed. "Isabela needs to learn the realities of life. Responsibility, discipline, focus. I'm certain that this arrangement will help guide her away from the path she's currently on." Thomas swallowed hard, his mouth dry as the gravity of the situation settled in. He knew better than to question Adrian's motives out loud. Yet, there was a flicker of doubt in his mind, a voice asking what kind of father would go to such lengths to control his daughter's future. "But does Isabela know about this?" Thomas asked cautiously, his voice tinged with incredulity. It was difficult to imagine Isabela, who wore her defiance like a crown, agreeing to such a scheme. "She doesn't need to know the details right now," Adrian replied, his tone as firm as his jaw. "She will understand in time. What matters is that you agree to this and help me guide her back onto a more stable path." Thomas's gaze fell to the floor. There was a flicker of something inside him, a mix of resentment and resignation. He had admired Adrian for his unrelenting drive, for the way he seemed to bend the world to his will. But this was different. This was not about business or innovation. It was about manipulating the life of another person. He took a breath, steadying himself. "Mr. Montero," he began slowly, "I don't know if I'm the right person to—" Adrian cut him off with a sharp gesture. "You are the right person. You've worked hard, shown integrity, and you understand the importance of discipline. You've seen how I run my life, my business. That is exactly what Isabela needs." The room fell silent as Thomas considered his options. He thought of the years he had spent laboring in the gardens, studying by the dim light in the small apartment he shared with his mother. He thought of his own dreams, of finishing his engineering degree and starting a career. Marrying Isabela could open doors that he never imagined reaching. But could he truly go through with this, knowing that it was a decision rooted in someone else's control? "Do you really think that forcing her into a marriage will make her happy?" he finally asked, daring to challenge Adrian's logic. "Happiness is a fleeting concept," Adrian responded, his tone dismissive. "What I am concerned with is her future. Happiness can come later, when she's safe and secure." Thomas's jaw tightened. He understood the weight of what Adrian was asking. It wasn't just a proposal. It was an expectation, a demand wrapped in the guise of an opportunity. If he refused, he might lose not just the goodwill of a powerful man, but also the stability that he had worked so hard to build for himself and his mother. Thomas's voice came out low but resolved. "If you truly believe that this is what's best for Isabela," he said, "then I'll do it." Adrian's expression softened just slightly, as though he was pleased to hear what he already knew would be said. "Good. Then it's settled." As Thomas left the office, a strange mix of emotions coursed through him. He had agreed to something monumental, something that could change the course of his life, and Isabela's forever. Yet, the reality of what he had just accepted felt surreal, as though the ground beneath him had shifted, leaving him to navigate a landscape where the rules had suddenly changed. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he wondered what would happen when Isabela found out that her future had just been bargained away without her consent. Chapter 2. The ceremony was brief, carried out with a formality that left no room for joy. Isabela's white dress was as pristine as it was lifeless, her face a mask of indifference. Beside her, Thomas tried to appear calm, though his unease was clear in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. As they exchanged vows, the words came out hollow, without the weight of genuine commitment. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, there was no kiss, no applause, only the restrained silence of a deal being sealed. As they walked away from the ceremony, the tension between them was palpable, the distance evident even in the way they held themselves, close enough for appearances, but with a gulf of unresolved emotions separating them. Adrian observed them quietly, his expression betraying neither satisfaction nor doubt. To him, this was a necessary step in shaping his daughter's future, no matter how much she resented it. Later that evening, the newlyweds found themselves alone in the room they were now expected to share. The air was thick with unspoken words as Isabela stood by the window, her back to Thomas, who sat awkwardly on the edge of the bed. Her shoulders were rigid, her posture brimming with restrained anger. Finally, she turned to face him, eyes sharp and filled with a contempt she no longer cared to hide. "Why did you do it?" she demanded, her voice low and cutting. "Was it worth it? Whatever reward my father promised you." Thomas remained seated, meeting her gaze steadily. He had known this moment would come, yet facing her accusations was more difficult than he had anticipated. "He didn't promise me anything," he replied, his tone calm but firm. "And I didn't do this for a reward," she scoffed, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Then what, Thomas? What could possibly make you agree to marry someone you don't even know?" Her voice trembled slightly, revealing the hurt behind her anger. "Was it just the thrill of being able to say you're married to a Montero?" "No," he answered, standing up now, his voice growing more resolute. "It wasn't about that. I thought I could help." "Help?" Isabela interrupted, her eyes flashing with disbelief. "How exactly is this helping? Do you think being forced into this marriage is something I need saving from? Or do you see yourself as some kind of knight in shining armor?" His frustration finally broke through. "I don't think I'm saving anyone," he shot back, his voice rising. "But I also don't think either of us had much of a choice, did we? Your father decided this would happen, and whether we like it or not, here we are." "Don't put this on me," she snapped. "You had a choice, Thomas. You could have said no." "And then what?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Do you really think your father would have let that be the end of it? He would have found another way to control you, Isabela, and maybe it would have been worse. At least with me. You know I'm not here to manipulate you. I'm just trying to make this as bearable as possible." The room fell into a heavy silence. Isabela looked away, her jaw clenched, as if fighting back words she didn't want to say. After a moment, she let out a slow breath, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't ask you to protect me." "I know," Thomas replied quietly, "but that doesn't mean I'm not going to try." She turned back toward the window, as though dismissing him from the conversation. "You can try all you want," she said, her voice edged with resignation. "But it doesn't change the fact that this marriage is nothing more than my father's latest power play." Thomas stood there for a moment, as if considering a response, but he said nothing. Instead, he picked up his jacket and left the room, closing the door behind him without another word. Isabela remained by the window long after he had gone, staring out at nothing in particular, her reflection in the glass more a stranger than a bride. The reality of her new life settled over her like a suffocating weight, and for the first time that day, she allowed herself to feel the full extent of her isolation. As she sat down on the edge of the bed, the silence of the room seemed to stretch on endlessly, an unwelcome reminder of everything she had lost and everything that was now expected of her. In the months that followed, life at the mansion settled into a cold routine. There was a formality between Thomas and Isabela, a sense of detachment that hung over every meal, every passing interaction. They moved through the same spaces as though they were ghosts, present but never truly seen by one another. Thomas made a few tentative attempts to reach out, trying to bridge the chasm of silence, but each time, Isabela pulled back, her responses curt and polite, but never inviting. It was as if she had drawn a line between them, a line he was forbidden to cross. Adrian kept a close eye on them, his shrewd gaze always observing. At first, he appeared satisfied, expecting that eventually, the sheer proximity would force the two to grow closer, that Thomas's patience would wear down Isabela's defenses. But as weeks turned into months and the distance between them persisted, Adrian's confidence began to waver. It was clear that his plan was not unfolding as smoothly as he had calculated. Thomas, however, was not one to give up easily. One evening, as he sat in his study surrounded by blueprints and notes, He found himself staring at a particularly challenging problem in his latest engineering project. It was a prototype he had been working on for months, a design for a more efficient battery system. He had hit a dead end, a point where his own expertise wasn't enough to push it forward. As he glanced over at the half-open door of the study, an idea took shape, a reckless, almost desperate idea. He found Isabela in the library, her usual refuge, reading a book in a large leather chair. She glanced up as he approached, her expression guarded as always. "Isabela," he began, standing a few steps away, as though giving her space to retreat if she wished. "I need your help with something." She looked at him skeptically, as if she hadn't heard correctly. "With what?" she asked, the tone of her voice not quite masking her suspicion. "It's an engineering project I've been working on," he said, shifting his weight slightly as he spoke. "I've hit a bit of a roadblock, and I could use a different perspective." She closed the book with deliberate slowness, setting it down on the table beside her. Her gaze was level, assessing. "I'm not an engineer, Thomas. I don't see how I could possibly help you." "I'm not asking for technical expertise," he replied, his voice steady. "I just need someone to look at the problem from a different angle. You see things differently, and I thought that might be exactly what I need right now." She raised an eyebrow, folding her arms. "And why me? Out of all the people you could ask, why come to me?" "Because you don't think like everyone else," he said simply. "You have an eye for detail, and you're not afraid to question things that don't make sense. Besides," he added with a faint smile, "you're brutally honest. If something's wrong, you won't hesitate to say so." The unexpected compliment seemed to catch her off guard. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in her expression, surprise, perhaps, or curiosity. But it faded quickly, replaced by her usual wariness. "Fine," she said after a long pause, her voice hesitant. "Show me the project." Thomas led her to the study, where papers and diagrams were scattered across the large oak desk. He explained the concept as concisely as he could, laying out the details of the design and the challenges he had encountered. Isabela listened carefully, her eyes moving over the blueprints, the diagrams, the small prototype parts arranged on the desk. When he finished, she looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "Your design has too many redundant components," she said, tapping one of the diagrams with her finger. "If you streamline the circuitry here and here, it would reduce the energy loss. And this," she pointed to another section, "looks like it could overheat if the power flow isn't regulated properly." Thomas blinked, momentarily taken aback. She spoke with a clarity and insight he hadn't expected, as if she had seen through the problem with a precision he hadn't been able to reach. "You're right," he said, genuinely impressed. "I hadn't thought of that. It could work." Isabela shrugged, but there was a faint glint in her eyes that hinted at something resembling satisfaction. "It's just an idea. You're the one who'll have to see if it actually works." "I appreciate it," he said, his tone sincere. "And thank you for giving it a chance. I know you didn't have to." She met his gaze, and for the first time in a long while, there wasn't the usual distance in her eyes. There was still a wall between them, but a crack had formed, a small opening that hadn't been there before. "You're right," she said quietly. "I didn't have to, but it's your project, not my father's. So I suppose it's different." Thomas nodded slowly, sensing his shift. "It means a lot," he said, and left it at that. Over the next few weeks, the project became a kind of unspoken agreement between them. Though their conversations remained focused on engineering, there was a subtle change in the atmosphere, a sense that perhaps they could speak to one another without the bitterness that had previously defined their relationship. Isabela would stop by the study, sometimes for just a few minutes to give a suggestion, sometimes for longer, lingering as they discussed adjustments to the design. During one such evening, as they reviewed the latest modifications, Thomas found himself glancing at Isabela, noticing for the first time the way her brow furrowed when she was concentrating, the slight tilt of her head as she considered a new idea. "You have a knack for this," he remarked, his voice thoughtful. "Have you ever thought about studying engineering?" She let out a small, almost reluctant laugh. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I don't think that's the path I'd ever take. I prefer things that aren't as predictable as numbers and equations." "Art, then?" he asked, recalling the few times he had seen her sketching in a notebook, the way she would sometimes disappear for hours into the studio her father had once dismissed as a hobby room. "Maybe," she said, her tone guarded again, as though afraid to reveal too much. "It doesn't matter. My father would never approve." "Then maybe that's exactly why you should pursue it," Thomas said, his words carrying a quiet conviction. She looked at him, a mixture of skepticism and something else, something almost like hope. But the moment passed quickly, and she turned back to the blueprints, her voice shifting back to the task at hand. "We should adjust this section next," she said, pointing to a schematic on the table. Thomas nodded, not pressing the conversation further. But as they continued to work, he couldn't shake the feeling that slowly, the ice was beginning to thaw. The engineering project marked the beginning of a subtle shift in the dynamic between Thomas and Isabela. What had started as a cautious collaboration began to evolve into something more comfortable, if still tentative. Their conversations grew less constrained, and there were moments when the tension that had once defined their every interaction seemed to fade. One afternoon, they found themselves in the library. It was supposed to be a brief discussion about some adjustments to the latest prototype, but once they finished with the technical details, the conversation lingered, drifting into less guarded territory. Isabela was seated on a plush armchair, one leg crossed over the other, absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the book she had set aside. Thomas leaned against a nearby bookshelf, the papers in his hands forgotten as he watched her with a kind of quiet curiosity. For a while, they talked about nothing in particular, music, books, a little about the news. But then, as if emboldened by the ease of the moment, Isabela's tone shifted. "You know," she said almost hesitantly, "my father never really understood my interest in art. He always saw it as impractical." Thomas's gaze was attentive, and he could hear a note of frustration beneath her calm demeanor. "I've seen some of your sketches," he replied, his voice soft. "They're good. It's clear you have a real talent." She shrugged, as if dismissing the compliment, but her eyes held a glimmer of appreciation. "Maybe, but talent doesn't mean much to him unless it can be measured in profit or prestige." She paused, then continued, her voice lowering. "The thing about the musician I was seeing, it wasn't just that he was different or rebellious. It was a freedom he had, the way he could live without feeling tied to someone else's expectations. I admired that." She glanced down at her hands, almost as if she regretted saying so much. "Being with him, it felt like I could finally be the version of myself that didn't revolve around what my father thought I should be." Thomas was quiet for a moment, digesting her words. He could see now that her relationship with the musician had been more than just a young woman's defiance. It had been an attempt to reclaim some part of herself that Adrian had tried to mold. "I get that," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Sometimes I feel like I'm stuck playing roles I didn't choose either." Her eyes met his, searching his face for sincerity. "You're saying that now?" she asked, a hint of challenge in her tone. "You're the one who agreed to marry me because my father asked you to. What kind of freedom is that?" Thomas didn't flinch. wasn't about freedom. It was about responsibility. He answered quietly. And yes, I made that choice. But that doesn't mean I don't wonder about what I could have been if I didn't have to think about making ends meet, about proving myself, about fitting into your father's plans. I think everyone wears masks at some point, some more willingly than others. She leaned back, her gaze softening. It's not just about masks. It's about who you are underneath them, and whether you even recognize yourself anymore. Her voice grew quieter, almost wistful. I think I've spent so much time trying to be what my father wanted that I forgot what I actually wanted. The vulnerability in her admission surprised Thomas. It wasn't the defiant, guarded Isabela he had come to know. This was someone more real, someone who, despite her frustration, yearned to be seen for who she truly was. He took a step closer, his expression earnest. If that's true, he said, then maybe it's not too late to start figuring it out. She gave a small, sad smile. And how do you suggest I do that when everything about my life has been decided for me? Even this marriage, it's just another part of his plan. That doesn't mean we can't make some decisions for ourselves, Thomas replied, his tone growing more assured. We can still find ways to make our own choices, even within the limits we've been given. It doesn't have to be about defying him for the sake of it, but about doing something because it actually matters to you. There was a moment of silence as Isabela considered his words. She stood up from the chair and walked to one of the bookshelves, her fingers running along the spines of the books, almost absently. You make it sound easy, she said softly, but I don't know if I even have the courage to try. He moved closer, stopping a few feet behind her. Maybe you don't have to do it all at once, he said. Start with something small, like your art. You said your father never took it seriously. Fine. Do it for yourself. Not for him. Not for anyone else. Just see what it feels like to pursue something because you want to. Isabela turned to face him, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. You're really saying I should just paint? As if that would change anything. I'm saying it could be a start, Thomas replied. It's not about the painting itself. It's about doing something that isn't dictated by anyone else. It's about taking back a piece of your life. She was quiet for a long time, studying him as though trying to gauge the sincerity behind his words. And what about you? She finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. If I start pursuing my passions, what will you do? Keep playing the dutiful husband? He met her gaze, his eyes steady. I'll figure it out, he said. Maybe it starts with helping you find your freedom, even if I haven't found mine yet. Her expression softened just slightly, and there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a shared understanding. For the first time, it felt like they weren't just two strangers stuck in a forced arrangement, but two people who were beginning to understand each other's struggles. As the moment hung between them, the quiet of the library seemed to amplify the unspoken possibility that lingered in the air. Without another word, Isabela walked back to the chair, picked up the book she had set aside earlier, and returned to her seat. But this time, the silence between them was different. Not the silence of strangers, but the silence of two people slowly learning to share the same space. As the bond between Thomas and Isabela grew, so did the layers of their guarded lives begin to peel away, revealing fragments of truths that neither had anticipated. The tentative truce was giving way to genuine camaraderie, and with each shared conversation or lingering glance, they discovered glimpses of each other that went beyond the constraints of their arranged marriage. Yet, amidst the newfound closeness, Thomas stumbled upon secrets that extended beyond their fragile relationship. One evening, Thomas was in Adrian's private study, tasked with organizing a box of old files Adrian had requested to be reviewed. He methodically sifted through documents detailing business transactions, patents, and records that chronicled Adrian's rise to power. As he reached the bottom of the box, he noticed a drawer in the desk slightly ajar, revealing the corner of a faded envelope inside. Curiosity got the better of him. He opened the drawer and found a bundle of letters tied together with a simple string. The paper was yellowed with age, and the handwriting was elegant, almost intimate. Thomas glanced at the topmost letter, the name Anna, clearly written at the beginning of each one. They were addressed to Adrian, but the tone was not businesslike. These were love letters, filled with words of passion and longing. And as he read further, he realized they chronicled a relationship Adrian had kept hidden. Anna wrote with fervor, describing moments of intense connection and shared dreams. But as the letters went on, a pattern of longing gave way to resignation. She spoke of Adrian's ambitions, the empire he was building, and how, with each passing day, it seemed to pull him further away from her. The last few letters were marked by a sense of finality, as if she had come to accept that his devotion to his career had eclipsed his love for her. Thomas stared at the letters in his hands, his thoughts racing. He had never imagined Adrian, a man who projected such control and pragmatism, as someone capable of the kind of passion and vulnerability that bled through Anna's words. It was as though he had found a key to a part of Adrian's life that contradicted everything Thomas thought he knew about the man. Taking a deep breath, he decided to confront Adrian. He needed to understand what had happened. If this lost love had somehow shaped the way Adrian treated Isabela, if it was connected to the rigid expectations he imposed on her. Later that night, Thomas found Adrian in the drawing room, a glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze fixed on some distant point in the room. He hesitated for a moment, but then approached, holding the letters in his hand. "Mr. Montero," Thomas began, his voice steady but edged with an urgency he couldn't suppress. "I found these while I was sorting through the documents you gave me." Adrian's gaze shifted, narrowing as he recognized the letters. His face hardened, a flicker of something almost like fear crossing his features, but he quickly masked it. "And you decided to read them, did you?" His tone was cold, but there was a weariness in his eyes that betrayed him. Thomas nodded, unwilling to back down. "They were addressed to you from someone named Anna," he said. "It was clear she meant a great deal to you. I couldn't help but wonder why you've kept these hidden all these years." Adrian remained silent, his jaw tightening as if holding back an uninvited emotion. He took a slow sip of his whiskey before finally speaking, his voice low and distant. "Anna was someone I loved a long time ago," he said, his words clipped, as though each one took effort to voice. "We had plans, dreams even, but I made a choice. I chose to pursue my ambitions, and the sacrifices I made included her." Thomas took a step closer, his expression earnest. "Is that why you're so insistent on controlling Isabela's life? Because you don't want her to make the same choice?" Adrian's gaze darkened, his eyes locking onto Thomas's with a sharpness that suggested he was treading on dangerous ground. "What I want," Adrian said slowly, "is for Isabela to have the life that will give her the most security, the most stability, a life that won't leave her vulnerable to whims and fantasies. But what if she's sacrificing what makes her happy for that stability?" Thomas pressed, his voice growing firmer. "What if, by trying to protect her, you're taking away her chance to choose for herself?" Adrian's expression softened, if only slightly, and for a moment he looked almost lost. "You think I don't know that," he replied, his voice quieter, almost a whisper. "You think I don't wonder if I'm doing the right thing? I've lived with that question for years. But I watched as Anna slipped away, as I let her slip away. because I thought I was doing what was best for us both. It wasn't just about ambition. It was about making sure I didn't end up with nothing." He paused, staring down into his glass as though seeking answers there. "In the end, I lost her anyway, and I've carried that regret with me. Even as I built this empire, perhaps I am trying to spare Isabela from the same fate. Or perhaps I'm just trying to convince myself that I'm not repeating my own mistakes." Thomas felt a pang of sympathy for the man standing before him, someone who had achieved so much but had never quite escaped the shadow of a choice that cost him something irreplaceable. "You can't keep trying to fix the past through her, Mr. Montero," he said quietly. "Isabela is not Anna, and you can't live her life for her." Adrian looked up at him, the lines on his face seeming deeper, as though the weight of his memories had carved them there over time. "And what would you have me do, Thomas?" he asked, his voice laced with a hint of challenge. "Simply step aside and let her pursue any reckless path that catches her fancy?" Thomas shook his head. "No," he said, "but you could at least trust her to find her own way. Support her, guide her if you need to, but don't try to dictate every step she takes. That's not protection, it's control." Adrian's lips pressed into a thin line, but he didn't respond immediately. There was a flicker of something in his eyes. Resignation, perhaps, or understanding. "You speak as if you know her better than I do," he finally said, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "I'm not saying that," Thomas replied, keeping his voice even. "But I see her, Mr. Montero, and I think she deserves a chance to be seen for who she truly is, not just as a reflection of your expectations." Adrian's gaze faltered, and for a moment, it was as if the years fell away, leaving behind not a powerful businessman, but a man grappling with the consequences of his own choices. He sighed heavily and turned his back on Thomas, his shoulders slumping slightly as he stared out the window. "Perhaps you're right," he murmured, "but it may already be too late." Thomas watched him in silence, recognizing that this moment was not one of defeat, but of reckoning. It wasn't just about Isabela anymore. It was about Adrian confronting the part of himself that had long been buried under layers of ambition and regret. Without another word, Thomas placed the letters back on the desk, leaving them within Adrian's reach. Then he quietly exited the room, allowing the older man to face the past he had kept hidden for so long. As he walked down the hallway, his thoughts turned to Isabela and the realization that there was still much to unravel, both in their relationship and in the web of secrets that had shaped the paths they were now on. Isabela's discovery of the letters and the private conversation between Thomas and her father ignited a surge of betrayal that coursed through her like fire. She felt blindsided, wounded not just by Adrian's secrets, but by Thomas's decision to involve himself in the murkiness of her family's past without telling her. The betrayal stung deeper because she had begun to trust him, begun to let him in, and now it seemed like he had used that opening to dig where he had no right. She found him in the garden, standing by a stone pathway surrounded by blooming flowers, the only burst of color in her otherwise bleak life. Without hesitation, she approached, her footsteps quick and purposeful. Her voice trembled with anger as she called out, her words sharp and direct. "You had no right to go through his past," she shouted, her cheeks flushed with rage. "How dare you meddle in things that don't concern you?" Thomas turned at the sound of her voice, his expression shifting from surprise to a guarded calm. He had expected a reaction, but the intensity of her anger still hit him like a slap. He took a step toward her, his voice measured but firm. "I did it because I needed to understand what's really going on, Isabela," he replied. "Your father's decisions are controlling both our lives, and you know that. There are things he's been hiding, things that shape the way he treats you." Her eyes flared as she took a step closer, her hands clenched at her sides. That doesn't give you the right to dig into my family's past like it's some kind of puzzle for you to solve, she spat, her voice rising with each word. You think you can just insert yourself into everything, that you can fix what's broken here. Maybe I can't fix it, Thomas retorted, his own frustration beginning to surface. But ignoring it isn't going to make it go away. You deserve to know the truth about why your father is the way he is. I thought you'd want answers, too. She shook her head, her voice trembling as it dropped. The truth? Or just your version of it? There was a hurt in her tone that went beyond anger, a deeper sense of betrayal that colored her words. I was beginning to think you actually cared about me, but now I see you were just digging around, looking for some explanation to justify staying in this marriage. Thomas's eyes widened at the accusation, and for a moment, he was struck by the rawness of her words. Isabela, it's not like that, he said, his voice softening. I did this because I do care. I wanted to understand your father's choices so that I could help you. Help us. Find a way forward that wasn't just about his expectations. But Isabela wasn't ready to let go of her anger. Help us, she scoffed, her voice cracking with the weight of unshed tears. You think going behind my back to talk to my father about his old love letters is helping? It's just another way of controlling me, just like he does. The accusation stung, but Thomas held his ground, his voice steady and sincere. No, Isabela, he said quietly. It was never about control. It was about facing what's been left unresolved. Your father is trapped by his past, by the regrets he carries about the life he didn't choose with Anna. That's why he's trying to shape your life so carefully, because he's afraid you'll end up making the same sacrifices he did. Isabela's expression softened ever so slightly, a flicker of doubt in her eyes as his words sank in, but she quickly masked it with a defiant tilt of her chin. So, what? She demanded. You think you can just dig up some old letters and suddenly understand everything about my father and me? You think that gives you the right to intervene? Thomas took a step closer, his gaze meeting hers with an intensity that matched her own. No, I don't think I understand everything, he admitted. But I do understand what it's like to be haunted by choices, by paths not taken. And I see it happening to you, too. You're letting his expectations define you, letting his mistakes cast a shadow over your life. She looked away, her jaw tightening as she fought the urge to give in to his words. And what do you expect me to do, Thomas? Defy him? Throw away the life he's built for me just because he might have regrets? Her voice wavered, the underlying pain coming to the surface. What if I end up regretting it too? He reached out, gently placing a hand on her arm, his voice calm but filled with urgency. I'm not saying it's easy, Isabela, he said, but you don't have to live your life under his shadow. You have the right to make your own choices, even if they're different from what he wants for you, even if they scare you. She took a step back, pulling away from his touch, her eyes narrowing as she struggled to keep her emotions in check. And what about you, Thomas? She asked, her tone edged with accusation. Are you ready to live outside of his expectations too? Or are you just saying this because you think it's what I want to hear? The question cut deeper than she intended, but Thomas did not flinch. He held her gaze, his voice steady as he spoke. I've spent my life trying to prove myself to your father, to my own circumstances. I won't deny that, he confessed, but I'm tired of living that way. I don't want to keep playing a role that doesn't feel real anymore. For a moment, the garden was silent except for the distant hum of the world outside. Isabela's anger seemed to drain away, replaced by a quiet sadness. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. You're saying all the right things, she said softly. But that doesn't change the fact that you went behind my back. You made decisions without me, And that's exactly what I'm trying to get away from." Thomas nodded slowly, his expression solemn. "You're right," he admitted. "I should have talked to you first. I should have told you what I found and asked if you even wanted to know. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I should have realized that this isn't just about finding answers. It's about us learning to trust each other." She looked at him, her gaze softening but still guarded. "Trust isn't built by keeping secrets, Thomas," she whispered, "even if you had good intentions." "I know," he replied, his voice steady, "and I'm willing to earn that trust back, if you'll let me." There was a long pause as Isabela weighed his words. She didn't respond, but there was a faint shift in her posture, a small sign that perhaps she was not entirely closing herself off. Without another word, she turned and walked back toward the mansion, leaving Thomas standing alone in the garden, the echo of their confrontation hanging in the air. As he watched her walk away, Thomas could only hope that she would one day understand that he had been trying to protect her, even if his methods had been flawed. There was still so much left unresolved between them, but he knew this confrontation had unearthed something important, something that couldn't be ignored. And as the door closed behind Isabela, Thomas realized that their path forward would not be easy, but it was one they had to navigate together, step by step, if they were ever to find their way out of the shadows of the past. With the truth out in the open, Adrian found himself standing at a crossroads he had never anticipated. The decisions that had defined his life, every calculated choice, every sacrifice made for the sake of his empire, had come at the expense of his own happiness. And now, those same choices had come full circle, threatening to cost him the only true family connection he had left. His daughter Isabela and the man he had chosen for her, Thomas, had formed a bond far deeper than he had anticipated, one that had emerged not from his control, but from defying it. Adrian knew there was only one way forward, and that was to confront the consequences of his actions head-on. He summoned both Isabela and Thomas to his study, a place that had always been a symbol of his authority, where so many of his plans had been devised and executed. But this time, the atmosphere was different. The usual air of command had been replaced with something quieter, something closer to humility. As they entered, Adrian was already standing by his desk, the letters from Anna resting on the polish would as a silent reminder of his own past. He glanced at his daughter and then at Thomas, his expression a mix of weariness and resolve. Isabela's face was guarded, her jaw tight, as though preparing herself for another lecture, while Thomas's gaze remained steady, waiting for Adrian to speak. "Thank you for coming," Adrian began, his voice steady but lacking its usual edge. "I've called you here because it's time we had a conversation, an honest one." He took a breath, and for a moment, the weight of years seemed to press down on his shoulders. "I need to acknowledge that I was wrong. In trying to protect you, Isabela, I ended up doing the opposite. I thought I was building a secure future for you, but all I did was create walls between us." Isabela's brow furrowed, and she exchanged a quick glance with Thomas before turning back to her father. "You can't just undo everything with an apology," she said, her voice calm but laced with frustration. "You forced the situation on us. You didn't trust me to make my own decisions. How am I supposed to believe that anything's changed?" Adrian nodded, as if expecting her response. "You're right," he replied. "This isn't about erasing what's already happened. I can't change the past, but I can give you the freedom to decide your own future." He looked directly at Thomas now, including him in the conversation. "If you and Isabela want to separate, you have my blessing. There will be no repercussions, no conditions. You're both free to walk away if that's what you truly want." Thomas's eyes widened slightly at the offer. He hadn't expected such a sudden surrender from Adrian, the man who had always seemed so unyielding. He glanced at Isabela, trying to read her reaction, but her expression was a mixture of surprise and something else he couldn't quite place. Isabela's voice broke the silence. "And what if we choose to stay?" she asked, the question hanging in the air. "Are you saying you'd actually let us live our lives without interference?" Adrian's gaze softened, and there was a flicker of regret in his eyes. "If you choose to stay together, that will be your decision, not mine," he said quietly. "I realize that by trying to control everything, I've only driven you further away, Isabela. It's not what I intended, but intentions mean little when the consequences hurt the people you love." He paused, his voice lowering. I don't want to lose you the way I lost Anna." Isabela's breath caught at the unexpected vulnerability in his tone. It was the first time her father had openly admitted to losing something that mattered to him, something beyond business, beyond ambition. She looked at him with a newfound awareness of his humanity, of the pain that lay beneath the rigid exterior he had maintained for so long. Thomas took a step forward, his voice calm but resolute. "We appreciate the choice you're giving us," he said. "But there's more at stake here than just whether we stay married. It's about trust, and whether or not you can truly accept that Isabela's decisions are hers to make, even if they don't align with what you want for her." Adrian's jaw tightened, and he looked away for a moment, as though struggling to let go of his need for control. But when he spoke again, his tone was softer. "I understand," he said. "Trust isn't something that can be demanded. It has to be earned. And I know I have a long way to go before I can earn yours, Isabela." There was a long silence as Isabela weighed her father's words. She looked at Thomas, searching his eyes for reassurance, and found a quiet encouragement there. Turning back to Adrian, she took a breath, letting the words come slowly. "If we stay together," she said, her voice steady, "it's not going to be because you allowed it. It's going to be because it's what we chose, on our own terms." Adrian's eyes met hers, and for the first time in a long while, there was a look of genuine acceptance. "Then that's how it should be," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You deserve to choose your own path, and I need to let you." As the reality of his words sank in, a subtle shift seemed to occur in the room, a release of tension that had lingered there for too long. It was not a perfect resolution, nor did it erase the mistakes that had been made, but it was a start, a step towards healing the fractures that had formed over years of miscommunication and misplaced intentions. Without waiting for a response, Adrian reached for the letters on the desk and handed them to Isabela. "These belong to a different life," he said, his voice low but steady. "A life I didn't choose. But that doesn't mean you have to follow the same path." She took the letters, her hand trembling slightly as she accepted them. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she admitted, her voice softer now. "But I'm going to figure it out, without feeling like I owe it to anyone but myself." Thomas reached out and took her hand, his touch a quiet promise of support. He looked at Adrian, his gaze firm but not unkind. "Thank you," he said simply, and there was a mutual understanding in the exchange, an unspoken agreement that the future, whatever it might hold, would no longer be dictated by past mistakes. Adrian watched as his daughter and Thomas left the room together, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he allowed himself a moment of stillness. He had always believed that control was the key to security, but perhaps it was time to learn that letting go could also be a way to keep what mattered most. That night, after leaving Adrian's study, Isabela and Thomas retreated to the quiet of the library, where they talked for hours. The conversation started cautiously, both of them tentative as they revisited the events that had brought them to this moment. The forced marriage, the struggle for trust, the secrets that had come to light. Yet, as the hours wore on, the tension gradually eased. Their voices grew softer, less guarded, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. Isabela sat on the edge of a leather armchair, her hands folded in her lap as she spoke. "We never really had a choice, did we?" she said, her tone a mix of resignation and newfound clarity. "Not when this all started. My father decided our future for us." Thomas, seated across from her, leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "No, we didn't," he agreed quietly. "But we have one now. It's up to us to decide where we go from here." She looked at him, her gaze steady. "I don't want to stay together just because it's what's expected," she said, her voice firm but laced with uncertainty. "I need to know that if we do this, it's because it's what we both want, not because we feel like we have to." Thomas reached out, taking her hand in his. "Isabela, I don't want us to be a product of your father's plans anymore," he said, his voice earnest. "What we've built, whatever it is, didn't come from his control. It came from us, from the time we spent trying to understand each other. Even when it wasn't easy." She felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, a sense of recognition that went beyond their shared history of obligation. "It's strange," she murmured, her eyes dropping to their joined hands. "For so long, I felt trapped by the decisions others made for me. But when I'm with you, it doesn't feel that way." Thomas's fingers tightened gently around hers. "That's because it's different," he said. "It didn't start with love, and maybe it still isn't that. But there's something real here, something worth fighting for." He took a deep breath before continuing. "If we choose to stay together, it's because we're building something new, something that's truly ours." Isabela met his gaze again, and this time there was no hesitation in her eyes. "Then let's choose each other," she said softly. "Not out of duty, not out of fear, but because we want to see where this can go. I want to try it if you do." "I do," Thomas replied, a small smile tugging at his lips. More than anything, with that quiet agreement, the room seemed to shift, the air filling with a sense of shared purpose. The choice they made felt different from any decision either of them had taken before, free from the weight of Adrian's influence, free from the ghost of unmet expectations. It was not a promise of perfection, but it was a promise of something real. In the days that followed, the changes were subtle yet significant. Their routines remained much the same, but the way they approached each other began to transform. There were more quiet conversations shared over morning coffee, more unspoken understanding in the way they moved through the house together. When they spoke of their future, it was not about obligations or responsibilities, but about dreams they wanted to pursue together. Isabela found herself in the art studio more often, the space that had once felt like a guilty escape, now becoming a sanctuary where she could rediscover her creativity. Thomas would join her there sometimes, not to intrude, but to offer quiet company as he worked on his own designs. His sketches for a new kind of energy system that he hoped would make a meaningful difference in the world. One evening, as Isabela was adding the final touches to a painting, Thomas approached, holding a small device he had been tinkering with for weeks. "I finally got it to work," he said, a hint of pride in his voice as he showed her the prototype. "It's a new energy storage unit. Smaller, more efficient, and sustainable." She looked at the device, then back at him, her eyes bright with admiration. "You've been working on this for so long," she said, reaching out to touch the polished metal. "And you actually did it." Thomas nodded. "It's just the beginning," he said, then glanced at her painting, a mixture of vibrant colors that seemed to pulse with life. "Just like your art, you've been putting so much of yourself into it lately. It's incredible." A soft smile spread across her face. "Thank you," she said. "I think, for the first time, I'm creating something just for me, and I'm not afraid of what my father will think anymore. Their shared achievements marked the beginning of a new chapter, one where art and engineering, dreams and reality, blended into a life they were shaping together. It wasn't about Adrian's expectations or even about proving anything to each other. It was about finding joy in what they were building day by day. Adrian observed these changes with a quiet acceptance. He saw the way his daughter's laughter returned, heard the warmth in her voice when she spoke to Thomas. There was a lightness in her step that hadn't been there for years, a confidence that didn't come from his approval, but from the choices she was finally making for herself. And Thomas, the young man who had started as a tool in his grand plan, had become something far more, someone Adrian could respect, not for his obedience, but for the strength of character he had shown. In the quiet moments when Adrian found himself alone in his study, he would sometimes take out the letters from Anna, though he no longer felt the same sting of regret. Instead, there was a sense of closure. He had tried to control the destiny of those he loved, believing it was the only way to keep them safe. But now he understood that true love wasn't about control. It was about letting go. He had to let Isabela find her own way, to make her own mistakes, and to succeed on her own terms. Isabela and Thomas didn't know what lay ahead, but they were no longer concerned with the expectations they had once felt bound by. Together, they began to shape a life that merged their passions, a workshop where technology and art intertwined, where Thomas's innovations inspired new artistic creations, and Isabela's visions pushed him to think beyond the boundaries of engineering. As they continued to navigate this new path, hand in hand, there was a shared understanding that the journey would be filled with challenges. But those challenges were theirs to face together. It was not the life they had once thought they would be living, but it was the life they had chosen. One filled with hope, ambition, and a love that had grown in the most unexpected of places. For Adrian, watching his daughter's happiness unfold and seeing the man Thomas had become, there was finally a sense of peace. He had spent his life trying to shape the future, believing it was his duty to protect those he loved from the chaos of uncertainty. But now, as he saw the smiles on their faces and the quiet determination in their eyes, he understood that the freedom to choose was the greatest gift he could have ever given. And in that realization, he found a kind of love he had never known before, one that did not possess or control, but simply allowed. If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.